Hey. Well, hello, and a very warm welcome back to the Andrew Eborn Show with me, Andrew Eborn, where we unpack the big story with the sharpest minds. And today we're on the eve of something huge. Rachel Reeves' Spring Statement drops tomorrow, March the 26th. And who better to break it down than a true economic powerhouse, the former joint head of the UK Government Economic Service, a best-selling author and voice that cuts through the noise. Please welcome back the
Mm.
brilliant Vicky Pryce. Fantastic you're here. Lovely to see you again, Vicky.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction.
And it's very good. I love the fact we were both on Times Radio again this morning.
I know this is terrible, really, because it means getting up very, very early in the
Oh,
morning.
tell me
So,
about it.
and
So,
of course, there is so much going on, and the spring statement, as you rightly are saying, is actually a rather important moment in Rachel Reeves' history as Chancellor, which hasn't been very long so far, but this is a very, very important milestone, if you like, to tell us what perhaps to expect for the next few years, possibly, although things change by the minute, as far as I can tell.
well, I think that's right. But Rachel Reeves. I mean, she's promised no major tax or spending shocks, but with economic growth sluggish and borrowing costs are obviously up, what do you think we can realistically expect from her address?
I think what she's going to talk about now, given that there's been so much that's already been pre-announced, such as the welfare cuts that are going to be taking effect over the next few years, and extra money perhaps that she's found for housing and other bits that she's going to make quite a lot of. In reality, the focus is going to be very much on meeting still the fiscal rules that she has imposed on herself, and we're going to get the Office for Budget Responsibility coming up with a new figures for growth, certainly over the next few years, but also what it all means, given everything that's been announced or pre-announced or intended or postponed or whatever, for the fiscal side as well. So what's going to happen to a debt to GDP, what's going to happen to the actual fiscal deficit, which is going to remain with us for quite some time, and whether some of the other rules that she set herself, such as not borrowing for day-to-day spending, are going to actually come to fruition, because they're not expected to happen immediately, but over a sort of 3-year period. So it's in the future. So whatever we're going to hear, I think, tomorrow is going to be very much trying to pacify the markets, that they know what they're doing, they're on top of the finances for the government, they are looking for efficiencies wherever they can, such as cutting civil servants, possibly. But then I think very crucially, we can see what the intention is in terms of spending after the first 2 years of this parliament are over, when we had spending increasing originally by 1.3% per annum, which is reasonable. It still means cuts in various government departments that are non-priorities. Priority ones are, of course, health and now defence. And now we may well see that increase trimmed to what people are saying and assuming perhaps 1.1%, just to stay within the fiscal rules.
Now, obviously, you've seen plenty of fiscal events in your glorious career from your time as joint head of the UK Government Economic Service to now. The Office of Budget Responsibility is likely to deliver a gloomier
Mm.
forecast than last autumn. How much pressure does this put on Reeves to tweak her fiscal rules despite her unclad stance?
Well, the interesting thing is, of course, it didn't exist, the Octopus Budget Responsibility, when I was a civil servant. It's sort of, I left shortly after the coalition government came to power, and the Office of Budget Responsibility was set up around then. And of course, it has assumed quite a lot of power. And the reason why it's now so important is because, following what happened with Liz Truss when she tried to bypass them and then realized, that was a mistake because the markets didn't like it, it's now been enshrined in law that they have to be involved in big decisions, or at least or look at the big decisions, spending decisions that the government makes. And their pronouncements, if you like, are now becoming very, very important in terms of telling us whether the tick is given, if you like, to what the government is doing, or whether there is any serious concern. Because we've had periods when the head of the Office of Budget Responsibility has said that, well, implied that all these figures that we were looking at were real fiction, really, because they hadn't been supported by any real details of where some of the cuts, perhaps, or some of the increases might be. And we're still not going to get that,
Right.
unfortunately, tomorrow, because the spending review isn't happening until the summer. So we're only going to get broad figures with quite a lot of the details still not there.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is going to worry them.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the Spring Statement, it isn't meant to be a full budget, but there's a buzz it could turn into a mini budget with spending cuts or even some tax tweaks. Given the geopolitical mess, I'm thinking about Trump's tariffs, Russia's move, that sort of thing. Do you think Reeves will stick to her one fiscal event a year pledge, or will she have to act?
It may all change if there is a real emergency ahead. I mean, if the geopolitics go wrong, or if the tariffs that they're trying to avoid being imposed on UK exports by the US are in fact, imposed, and it means really lower growth in the economy, then they may need to do something more. But there is also the question of defence. So a lot of the speculation has been on whether perhaps there would be enough justification for changing the fiscal rules. In other words, saying, well, we're going to borrow a little bit more than we actually said we were going to, because there is now an emergency because of Ukraine. Given that the US is exiting a little bit in terms of the support it's going to be given. In fact, the US is cutting its own defense spending by something like 8% per annum over the next 4 years, which is quite extraordinary, very large. It means that Europeans have to overcompensate. We've seen Germany going down that route. We've seen the Europeans, in fact, setting up a new fund to which, for the moment, the UK is not included. But we could be a little bit more adventurous in terms of how we look at covering some of that extra spending. And if we did that, then the markets probably would be quite accepting as well. But as it is, I think the government is still new, in inverted commas, and also perhaps lacks the confidence to really go out of its way and saying, well, we are now in an emergency situation. Yes, as you suggested, perhaps we need more fiscal events than we said in the future, perhaps. But also, perhaps we need to go out and borrow a little bit more and not worry too much about our fiscal rules. And the markets will forgive us if we say it in the right way. Well, perhaps, but I don't think that's going to happen tomorrow.
Yeah, no, interesting. I mean, as you say, defence is a hot topic. Keir Starmer's pushing for 2.5% of GDP by 2027, partly funded by slashing overseas aid. You've written about Brexit and economic trade-offs. How do you see this shift impacting the UK's global standing and its wallet?
Well, yes, I think in terms of growth, which I think is going to be a very important part of making up for some of the need to spend extra in various areas. Well, there we're not going to get anything very much from the OBR. I think the expectation is they're going to cut their forecast from the nearly 2% they had originally for 2025 to just around 1%, which is very much in line with what most forecasters are saying right now. What I think Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer are going to need is more growth. And as things stand, we're not going to get it very much, because what we've got is increased cost to businesses because of the tax increases that have taken place. What it means is that we need to look outside that. Whatever we may do with the US, they are, of course, important as a single country to whom we export, or to which we export. But really, the EU is still the biggest partner, and we need to improve the relations with them. So there are quite a lot of voices now saying, perhaps we use the defence cooperation as a way to also improve our overall trade situation with the EU. We have to, of course, rethink what the agreement that we struck needs to do in the future to be changed to adapt to the new environment. It needs to be revisited anyway next year. So perhaps there is an opportunity to get closer. There are calls for joining the customs union, but certainly there is a lot that can be done to improve that side. And if that were to be the case, then maybe growth will look a little bit better, and it will make Rachel Reeves' position easier in terms of meeting some of her rules. But it's not going to be a magic wand that's going to suddenly sort of sort everything out. And unfortunately, we need to work on this. And it's going to take some time for confidence really to return to businesses, and also the consumer is still a little bit worried about what all the tax increases may mean for jobs.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. No magic wand and no magic money tree, as we remember very well. Inflation's obviously crept back up. Interest rates are sticking high, and businesses are grumbling about tax hikes and minimum wage rises kicking in next month. What's your take on how Reeves might balance these pressures in the Spring Statement? Any surprises up her sleeve for households or firms?
I wouldn't think so. I mean, the important thing to bear in mind is that quite a lot of those increases in inflation that we've already seen and are likely to continue to see for a few months are self-imposed. So it's things like council tax going up, transport costs, going up. So there is a lot that is happening, such as, for households, also electricity price increases, which they've had to do because the electricity price cap and the way that it works. So there is a lot there, which hopefully will just disappear from the 12-month figure, which is the one that really matters if you look year on year. Because we've already seen, despite the concern about tariffs, the latest data from the US suggested a drop in inflation. We've seen a drop in inflation in Europe, where they are more worried about deflation sort of emerging at some point. We've seen oil prices, yes, up and down a little bit, but overall not really being a serious threat. Yes, gas prices have gone up a little bit recently, but overall what we're seeing is that the external stuff, if you like, is quite positive, but the internal stuff remains a worry. So there is a concern about extra costs of labor because of the tax increases that have taken place. There is concern also about new labor laws that may come through, which increase costs. Also the wage side, where minimum wage is going up above inflation as of next month. So all these things could well keep wages quite high. So what I think Richard Reeves is hoping is that as things perhaps stabilize a little bit, the Bank of England may cut rates again a little bit more aggressively as everyone had hoped. It hasn't happened. And that is a real concern. Without a real substantial decline in interest rates, then we're not going to see the situation improve, particularly in terms of the economy. And for the government itself, while bond yields stay as high as they are and may get even higher if there is more borrowing to be done, what we may find is that, of course, there is an increasing concern about being able to service the debt. Servicing the debt costs 100 billion a year, which is huge, with interest rates as high as they are in the bond market. So thinking of what she could perhaps do, what businesses are asking for possibly is a cut in VAT in various areas. That would bring, of course, inflation down, quite easily, but whether it's sustainable, it's a different question. So I doubt very much there's going to be any real sort of room for her to pacify businesses and improve the inflation situation through whatever she says tomorrow.
Right. And you've obviously been very vocal about post-Brexit challenges, including on the Andrew Eborn Show. With Trump's tariffs disrupting trade and the UK upping defence spending, do you think the Spring Statement will signal a rethink on how we position ourselves economically in this rather shaky world?
Well, quite likely we are going to be giving quite a lot of concessions to the US just to be able to avoid having those tariffs imposed on us, the extra tariffs, because of course we've already been covered by the tariffs or at least affected by the tariffs on steel and aluminium, which President Trump has imposed. There is an issue of rethinking the way in which the economy is run. So we've seen already quite a lot of changes happening to regulation, or at least the intention to reduce regulation in the financial markets as well. We're seeing now discussions which may well be announced tomorrow in terms of what they may lead to for not taxing or not imposing, increasing, or even possibly, in fact, abandoning completely the online sales tax, which the government had imposed on the big tech companies. So that only raises about 800 million a year, but nevertheless, I think this could well be one of the conditions by the US in terms of having any sort of trade deal, however mini trade deal there may be between us and the US. But there has to be a rethink which is a bit wider than that. Just deregulating has loads and loads of risks attached to it. And we need to also think about how our relationship with Europe might improve in terms of trade, and if we deregulate in a way that is against what happens in the EU itself, we might find it actually more difficult to get around the various issues that we are concerned about, so that we can ease trade between particularly sort of smaller firms and the EU, which has been quite significantly affected. So regulatory harmonization, if you like, is something that we should be going for. If we deregulate by ourselves, then that may well be an issue for the future.
Yeah. Well, now welfare reforms obviously brewing and hitting the headlines. £5 billion in cuts to sickness and disability benefits have already been floated. The Resolution Foundation warns that up to 1.2 million could lose out. How do you see this playing out in Reeves' statement tomorrow? Will she soften the blow or double down?
Well, what, of course, Rachel Reeves has said, and others have said, of course, in the government, is that they are also putting quite a lot of money into encouraging people to go back to work and extra support, so health support and all that. But the skeptics amongst us will look at all this and say all they're trying to do is cut 5 billion in spending. And that 5 billion might get them into the fiscal rules being met and perhaps having a little bit of headroom available, which they had to give to the Office of Budget Responsibility before they did the calculations on where we might end up by the end of this parliament and still meet the rules that have been self-imposed, if you like. So whether in fact some of those savings will in the end materialize and whether people will end up not getting one type of benefit but getting something else because they just simply cannot get into work anyway, or perhaps there is more pressure on the National Health Service itself as a result of people not getting the support and therefore needing a different type of help, is a big question mark. So there are doubts about the reasons for doing it. There are doubts about whether that 5 billion can be achieved, but it is causing huge amount of concern to many people. And also politically, it hasn't gone down particularly well with quite a lot of Labour MPs.
Yeah, I mean that's certainly true, and there's fear generally for people who think they're going to lose their benefits. They need to have clarity, and I always say focus on those who are abusing the system, get rid of those, and make sure those that genuinely need help are helped in the proper way. Now, your books, including the brilliant "The Economy's Stupid," break down complex stuff for voters. If you were advising Rachel Reeves right now, what's the one thing you'd tell her to focus on in the Spring Statement to win back public trust amid all this economic noise?
Well, you mentioned the issue of tax, which is a really interesting one that she did say she wasn't going to be doing this again. However, if you look at the path of growth over the next few years, the likelihood is, if anyone would look at it from business, is that there will be more tax increases coming our way. Now, if she were able to avoid that completely and really and seriously suggest that they're not going to change things again the way they did before. She said it already, but I don't think very many people necessarily believe it. And manage to improve confidence, then that would be helpful. But the one thing that I think is really, really significant for growth is to get entrepreneurship going. I mean, talking about improving productivity in the public sector, well, yes, perhaps it gets a little bit there, but the trickle down isn't going to be that significant. It's really in the private sector where you need to encourage investment. You need to actually encourage competition, not go the other way, which is what this government seems to have been doing, but actually encourage more competition and have a watchdog which really, really does the right thing and have regulators who really are doing what is expected of them so that there is confidence that the system works and that it is not tilted towards perhaps overly towards the city maybe or towards the big firms, but actually cares quite a lot about the smaller players. The smaller players, of course, can be quite significant. And of course, they are major employers.
Right.
And that, I think, is where the focus should be.
Yeah. Okay. Very clear advice. She should listen to you. It would be helpful. Now, Labour, as you mentioned, facing a backlash from its own MPs over cuts, and Reeves was just £10 billion of headroom against her fiscal rules, less than the OBR's typical forecast swing. Could the Spring Statement be a make or break moment for her credibility as Chancellor?
I think so much has already been said about what she's going to be telling us tomorrow that I think she'll survive this. But if for some reason the OBR forecasts are even more depressing about the economy than we think, then I think that would be a serious question mark, because we did hear an awful lot about growth being what this government was going to be focusing on. And without that, just remember we had a drop in GDP in January.
Yes.
Again.
0.1% or whatever it is.
Yes, it may be tiny, but it's an indication of,
it's a drop.
Things not going well. Yes, it could, of course, recover, but yeah, if if we don't get that growth, then it will be very, very difficult. And also because of the cuts that we are likely to hear about tomorrow, particularly the reduction in the expected growth in spending in the later years of this parliament by the government, then we're not going to get the improvement in public services either. And that is not going to be good for the current government going into another election in the future. So growth is important. And that, I think, is where loads of, certainly economists are going to be focusing on when they put the
No, you're absolutely right.
verdict,
And I think if you have your sound bites and you say growth, 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 people remember that if there isn't, it's going to come back to bite you. So looking beyond tomorrow then, Vicky, what's your big picture prediction for the UK economy in 2025? You've got the Spring Statement, obviously, as a launch pad. Are we heading for stability, stagnation, or something else entirely different?
Well, most of the forecasts are around 1% growth. Yes, the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, thought it was perhaps likely to be 1.4%, but they have still reduced it from 1.7%, and they keep reducing it. So they probably will reduce it again when they put their new states forecast together. But the truth is that it's difficult to guarantee, even with the best will in the world, stability when you have all these geopolitical factors around us and President Trump. And also what's happening in Europe. There is one side which perhaps can look reasonably optimistic, which is, if you start spending more on defense is a bit of an economic department. It has trickled down impacts on quite a lot of sectors of the economy with the extra R&D, technical spending that needs to be done, manufacturing, etc., etc. So all that is reasonably good news. And you've also got the consumer who, for the moment, is seeing their real incomes increase, and they've done so now for over a year and a half, nearly 2 years, month after month, because inflation has been coming down and wages have stayed quite high. They have, of course, been hit by tax threshold freezes, so loads more people are now paying tax. But they do have some cash, and there is indeed the likelihood that tomorrow we're going to see the freeze extended to the end of this parliament again, as was intended originally, because they need to get the extra cash from income tax. But what we are perhaps going to still see is that the consumer has quite a lot of savings. They're not spending them. So what you need is to get that confidence to come back again, so they go out and do so. There've been some hints that this is beginning to happen. So we've seen some reasonable retail sales in the last couple of months. I think the government must hope that this continues. But at the heart of it all is also interest rates. If they do come down, as had been forecast originally, and they come down to a reasonable level, because they're a bit too high for the type of inflation we have in the present, then perhaps she will get a little bit more of that growth happening. And she may not need to do anything major on taxes. But can I just add one final thing on the tax front, if I may, which is that in reality, if you ask someone who is working and gets their pay packet, what is it you worry about? Would you worry if income tax rates go up? They'll say, of course. I mean, that's where they focus generally in terms of thinking of what might be left. You ask them about national insurance contributions, they don't quite understand it. And yet the Conservatives managed to reduce national insurance contributions for employees, giving back something like 20 billion to people who probably don't even realize that they've got that, because they didn't expect it necessarily. It never figures in people's thinking. So if I had been the Chancellor, I would have reversed that immediately. I would have taken away an awful lot of the costs and the pressures we're seeing now. And maybe even, since we started talking about welfare, those welfare cuts needn't have happened.
Yeah, no, sound advice. Finally, Vicky, you and I have shared studios, more platforms than Paddington together. It's always a delight. Lots of people have been writing into me, very impressed with your bookshelves. It looks as though you've actually read those books. Most people don't. How many of those books have you read?
Well, strangely enough, the vast majority, and the reason for it, I mean, there have been times when people, when I was doing TV interviews, would say, could you please switch your background off? thinking that it was a made-up background, that it wasn't really a library, but I tried to look intellectual, if you like.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing about the numbers is that for a very long period of time, when I was working in the bank, I was also a reviewer for the Banker magazine. So
Ah,
I was getting every month about 10 to 12 books, and I would
right.
review the vast majority of them. So you just multiply that. I was doing it for a number of years, month after month, 10 books. You just get to hundreds and hundreds
Right.
as a result. I do throw things away every now and then, but
Mm.
you need time for that. And I haven't had it recently.
No, I understand. What are you reading at the moment?
Well, actually, I'm about to do an interview on work. So I've been talking to Julia Hobsbawm. I've contributed something for her own publication on work and how things are changing. So I'm focusing on that today.
Okay, fantastic. Vicky Pryce, an absolute delight as always. Thank you very much for being my guest today.
Thank you.
And just before we go, Vicky, you wanted to say something about Jeremy Hunt.
Well, yes. I mean, as Chancellor, as the last Chancellor before the elections, of course. I mean, he was very involved in lots of the decisions that were being made, and it's really interesting how this national insurance contributions reduction for employees has been pivotal. Really, it's been such an important reason why there is or was that a big hole in finances. We all knew that a Labour government would have to do something about it, or whichever government came to power. But it is extraordinary when you go around and ask people, do you realize how much was given by Jeremy Hunt in two doses? First in January, effectively, 2024, and then again in April 2024, with those two cuts, 2% each time for national insurance contributions for employees. People just don't quite get the figure. And when you say it's 10 billion each time, and yet most people that you'd ask, about the pay packet and what is it that they're worried about if this government does anything, they would only talk about income tax. I mean, national insurance contributions don't quite feature in people's understanding. Or, okay, I'm not suggesting that they don't know what they're doing, but generally it is obscure. It's attached to what you pay, but it's got a different rate, and it only applies up to certain threshold. And used to be a different threshold, then it was etc etc etc. Then it was unified threshold, but it's quite obscure. And my suggestion would have been indeed reverse that, because most people wouldn't quite understand it anyway. And I'm not suggesting that the electorate is stupid or anything like that. It's just that it was a very clever thing to do by Jeremy Hunt before what he must have known would be an election coming pretty soon, which has left Labour with such a huge problem that it has not been able to really get round.
Very interesting. As you say, I think it's much easier for people who say, "Look, if I earn £1,000, this is how much is left, and this is the bits that's been taken off." It's much easier people that way. But that's what I love about bringing you on, and we can unpack that. And I always say, sunlight is the best disinfectant. We work out what those real figures, what those real figures mean. Vicky Pryce, an absolute delight as always. Enjoy those books.
Thank you very much. Bye
Take care.
bye.
Bye bye.